discussion.
Okay.
Linda Melvern, thank you for agreeing to have a chat. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Linda, can you just outline your history to date with respect to researching and writing about the genocide against the Tutsi?
Yes, I was in New York in April 1994. I was finishing my third book. My third book as an investigative journalist was about the United Nations, which in 1995 was going to be commemorating its 50th anniversary year. So it seemed timely to write an insider's account of the UN and what had happened to humankind's greatest experiment. And I was completing the book when Channel 4 decided to do a 3 one-hour series based on the book on the UN. So I was in New York in April 1994, and that is when I first began to look at the circumstances of the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda. You know, I came to this through the history of UN peacekeeping. So the first focus was on what was happening to the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, you know, this tiny force that had been sent to Rwanda to oversee a peacekeeping deal. And I must say that, you know, my work started then, and I've been full-time investigating the circumstances of the genocide now for 26 years, and I've written 3 books. The first, A People Betrayed, very much focused on what had happened at the UN at the time. And I must say that this is, of course, in New Zealand, you know, a proud moment for your diplomacy. I think that your ambassador at the time, Ambassador Colin Keating, will certainly go down in history for someone who stood up and really wanted something to be done at the time. In the face of the shameful reluctance, really, of the great powers, France, the UK and the US, who stood and did nothing.
It's correct to say, I think, that Colin Keating happened to be the chair of the UN Security Council in April 1994. Is that right?
Yes, New Zealand had a non-permanent seat on the council. You know, there are 10 non-permanent seats, and New Zealand had one of them. And Ambassador Keating was the president of the council at the time and really tried to force action on the council. He did absolutely everything that he could. As I say, to try to shore up, to reinforce the peacekeepers in Rwanda. You know, the great powers decided that they should be withdrawn. And I think it's thanks to Ambassador Keating that any stayed behind at all. He, as president, had to negotiate with a reluctant US, and there was an agreement that even though the bulk of the peacekeepers was withdrawn from Rwanda, 450 would stay on. If you like, as the British ambassador said, a token force in order to appease public opinion. But Keating knew what that force was doing, and he was well aware that Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, the force commander, would stay on and would try to save as many lives as possible.
Right. Just on this recent arrest of Paul Rusesabagina, obviously there's a Hollywood version of him, and then there's the reality. What do you know specifically about what actually happened at the hotel?
Well, it has been known for some time that this story really does not bear any scrutiny at all. I had the privilege to interview many of the UN peacekeepers and military observers who were in Rwanda, as I did Lieutenant General Dallaire himself. And these people were not protected by Paul Rusesabagina. I'm afraid he's not the Hollywood hero that so many people think he is. And there is testimony from the survivors of the hotel. There are 2 books written by the survivors of the hotel who describe how he charged for their rooms. He sold food and water to them. There was, in fact, a survey that was done of 73 survivors of the hotel, and only 3 thought that Rusesabagina had saved their lives, and only then because he allowed them to drink the water from the swimming pool where the genocidal forces were washing their uniforms.
Wow. Linda, your latest book is Intent to Deceive, and it reflects on the sort of genocide industry, the genocide denial industry, I should say. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what brought you to that subject matter, and what is it about the book that you think will surprise readers the most?
You know, I wrote A People Betrayed, the role of the West in the genocide of the Tutsi, and then I wrote a book having been given access to an enormous number of archives. And I wrote a book called Conspiracy to Murder, which detailed exactly how the genocide of the Tutsi was planned, how it was paid for, the genocidal ideology that underpinned it, and the propaganda that was used during it, before and during. And you know, with my other 3 books before I started work on Rwanda, afterwards there wasn't a sort of a lot of criticism that I'd got it wrong. And I began to see stories appearing that, in fact, you know, the genocide hadn't been planned at all, that it had been a spontaneous uprising, but all sorts of stories appearing, and especially over the web, you know, this inspired the genocide deniers. The ideology that underpinned the genocide of Hutu power and the movement didn't disappear. They weren't defeated in 1994. And they spread worldwide. They escaped. They lived under assumed names. And they promoted the stories that they had indeed promoted as the genocide was getting underway, in order to try to obscure and diminish their crime. And this was quite obviously a book. I don't think many people are really aware that Hutu power has conducted this vicious, racist campaign.
And where do they conduct it from? And how coordinated is it?
Well, there's a rather large community of, as I've said, the Hutu power génocidaires were not really defeated. You know, they spread worldwide and live in, certainly in London. You know, we have 5 alleged genocidaires here. There's a community of 30,000 Rwandans in Brussels, and there's quite a lot of denial that comes out of there. So I really think it's a failure to actually capture these people and put them on trial for charges of genocide. You know, the original list of those responsible runs into several hundred, and yet only 60 have been tried and convicted at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So there's quite a few genocidaires who live in our capital cities, yes.
Right. What do you think our obligation is to fight against these forces of denial? How can we do it in a social media age? How can we compete when we know that, as the saying goes, a lie travels halfway around the world before the truth's got its pants on? How do you combat that pervasive tendency to revise history and tell these alternative narratives around the genocide, which are all about, as you say, diminishing culpability? What's our way to best fight, apart from buying your book and reading it?
I think we had the lessons from the denial which followed the Holocaust. You know, there is a program of denial after every genocide. It's considered today to be a stage in the crime itself. And I think the only way to combat it is through factual evidence and research. I think, you know, every effort should be made to document this great crime, that killed up to 1 million people in Rwanda. And there is still a lot to do. The governments of France and the UK and the US, I'm not sure about your government doesn't fall into this category because it has documents on this. But the UK, France and the US continue to withhold a great deal of information that could tell us more about what happened and the planning and the financing of it. You know, it's not generally known, but a lot of the finance to pay for this came from the World Bank. So there is a great deal of work still to do, but we must, I think, try and insist that governments release their documents.
Okay, Linda, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm just going to stop the recording here.